Hey there, history enthusiasts. Today we're talking about the Titanic, but not in the way you've heard 1,000 times before. Forget the romance, forget the Leonardo DiCaprio frozen hand memes, we're diving into something way more interesting. The absolutely catastrophic chain of screw-ups that sent the unsinkable ship straight to the bottom of the Atlantic. Because here's the thing, this disaster wasn't just about an iceberg having a bad attitude. It was about human arrogance, corporate pressure, ignored warnings, and a series of decisions so questionable you'll wonder how anyone thought they were a good idea. We're talking about the fatal mistakes that turned engineering triumph into maritime tragedy. Before we start counting down this greatest hits album of what not to do on a ship, go ahead and smash that like button if you're ready for some serious historical deep diving, and drop a comment, where in the world are you watching from? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Whether you're in Tokyo, Toronto, or Timbuktu, welcome aboard. So buckle up because we're about to examine how overconfidence, bad luck, and some truly baffling choices created the perfect storm, or should I say, the perfect iceberg collision. This is the story of the Titanic disaster, mistake by mistake. Let's get into it. Now, let's talk about what might be the most expensive case of hold my champagne and watch this in maritime history. The Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a floating monument to human hubris wrapped in luxury dining rooms and premium-class arrogance. And the really fascinating part, the disaster didn't start when the ship hit ice. It started way earlier, in the minds of the people who built it, marketed it, and sailed it straight into history's most preventable tragedy. Picture this. It's 1912, and the world is absolutely drunk on technological progress. We're talking about an era when people genuinely believed humanity had basically conquered nature through engineering and industrial might. Electric lights? Check. Automobiles? Got them. Flying machines? Working on it. The prevailing attitude was essentially, we've figured everything out, what could possibly go wrong? Spoiler alert, literally everything. This wasn't just optimism. This was industrial age overconfidence on steroids, the kind of thinking that makes you wonder if anyone in the room ever asked, but what if we're wrong? Apparently not, because the White Star Line was busy printing promotional materials that might as well have said, "Dear icebergs, try us." The marketing campaign for the Titanic was something else entirely. The ship was promoted as practically invincible, a vessel so advanced that sinking was theoretically impossible. Not unlikely, not very safe, impossible. The company didn't quite use the word unsinkable in official advertising as much as popular myth suggests, but they sure didn't discourage the press and public from using it, and their promotional materials were happy to heavily imply it. One trade journal called it practically unsinkable, which is like saying something is practically fireproof and then acting shocked when it burns down. The difference between practically and actually turns out to be pretty significant when you're floating in the North Atlantic at 2 a.m, but we'll get to that. The point is, White Star Line and the British press created this aura of invincibility around the ship, and everyone from the corporate executives to the ship designers to the passengers themselves bought into it completely. It was the early 1900s equivalent of this tech startup will definitely never fail energy, except with more lifeboats at stake. Well, theoretically more lifeboats. We'll get to that particular problem in a minute. This confidence wasn't coming from nowhere, to be fair. The Titanic and her sister ships represented genuinely impressive engineering achievements for their time. These were the largest moving objects ever created by humans up to that point. The Titanic was 882 feet long, weighed over 46,000 tons, and featured technology that seemed almost magical to contemporary observers. She had watertight compartments controlled by electric switches on the bridge. You could seal off sections of the ship with the flip of a switch, which for 1912 was basically sorcery. She had a double-bottom hull for extra protection. The ship was designed so that even if several compartments flooded, she could theoretically stay afloat. On paper, it looked bulletproof, or in this case, iceberg-proof. The engineers had done the math, run the calculations, and concluded they'd created something revolutionary. Unfortunately, they'd also created a ship that existed in the real world, where physics doesn't care about your calculations and ice is remarkably indifferent to human confidence. But here's where the plot thickens and the mistakes really start piling up. Because when you've convinced everyone, including yourself, that you've built an invincible ship, you start making decisions based on that assumption. And those decisions? Not great. The entire culture surrounding the Titanic's construction and operation was soaked in this dangerous complacency. Safety protocols that might have seemed essential for a normal ship suddenly seemed like overkill for the mighty Titanic. After all, why worry too much about emergency procedures when your ship can't sink? It's like buying fire insurance for a swimming pool. Seems unnecessary until you remember that swimming pools can definitely still have problems. They're just different problems. This brings us to the design decisions that would later prove catastrophic, the kind of choices that seem reasonable right up until they're not. When the Titanic was being designed and built in Belfast shipyards, the team faced a constant balancing act between safety, luxury, and cost. And guess which one consistently won? If you guessed luxury, congratulations, you understand early 20th century capitalism. The ship was meant to compete for the wealthiest passengers crossing the Atlantic, which meant creating spaces that would make contemporary millionaires feel like they were in a floating palace, not a lifeboat with fancy curtains. The first-class accommodations on the Titanic were genuinely stunning. Grand staircases, ornate wood panelling, libraries, swimming pools, the works. One first-class suite cost $4,350 for a single voyage, which adjusted for inflation is somewhere north of $130,000 in today's money, for one trip across the ocean. These weren't passengers you wanted to inconvenience with unsightly safety equipment cluttering up the deck. Here's where it gets really interesting from a how did nobody catch this perspective. Those famous watertight compartments everyone was so proud of, they had a fatal flaw that's almost comical in hindsight. The watertight bulkheads, the walls separating each compartment, only went up to E deck, and some only to D deck. They didn't extend all the way up to create truly sealed compartments. Imagine building a fancy ice cube tray, being super proud of all the individual sections, and then realizing you forgot to make the walls tall enough so the water just spills over from one section to the next. That's basically what happened here. The ship could theoretically survive flooding in 4 compartments, which seemed like a reasonable safety margin. What the designers didn't fully account for was what would happen if more compartments flooded, or if water started pouring over those incomplete walls like a catastrophically expensive waterfall. The ship was designed to be watertight horizontally but not vertically, which is a bit like designing a bathtub that works great as long as you don't fill it too high. Not exactly ideal for something meant to float in the ocean. And then there's the lifeboat situation, which deserves its own special place in the What Were They Thinking Hall of Fame. The Titanic could carry 3,547 people at maximum capacity, passengers and crew combined. The number of lifeboat spaces available? 1,178. Not even enough for a third of everyone on board. Now before you think those monsters, there's context here, and the context somehow makes it worse. This wasn't some evil plan to sacrifice people, it was perfectly legal and actually exceeded the regulations of the time. British Board of Trade regulations from 1894 required lifeboats based on a ship's tonnage, not its passenger capacity, because apparently the government thought ships came with a maximum safe weight for humans, but unlimited capacity for optimism. Under these regulations, the Titanic was required to carry 16 lifeboats. She actually carried 20, which by the standards of the day made her extra safe. Gold star for effort, catastrophic failure for actual safety. The regulations hadn't been updated since the 1890s, when ships were significantly smaller. By 1912, ships had nearly tripled in size, but the regulations had stayed frozen in time like a particularly unhelpful time capsule. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, definitely worse. The Titanic's designer, a guy named Thomas Andrews, actually wanted to include more lifeboats. The ship had davits, those mechanical arms that lower lifeboats into the water, that were designed to handle up to 64 boats, enough for everyone on board. Andrews pushed for 48 boats initially, which would have been enough to save nearly everyone in the disaster. So why didn't they install them? Aesthetics and deck space. The White Star Line management decided that having too many lifeboats would make the deck look cluttered and might make passengers nervous by suggesting the ship wasn't as safe as advertised. Read that again. They removed safety equipment because it might imply they needed safety equipment. It's the maritime equivalent of refusing to wear a seatbelt because it suggests you might crash, except in this case, hundreds of people died because of it. The first-class passengers wanted their unobstructed promenade deck views more than they wanted comprehensive emergency evacuation capability, and the company was happy to oblige. After all, the ship couldn't sink, so the lifeboats were really more of a formality anyway. Just there for show, like decorative fire extinguishers or purely ornamental parachutes. There's also the small matter of how those lifeboats that did exist were tested and certified. The boats were tested by filling them with weights, not actual people, and the tests were done in calm harbours, not in the North Atlantic at night with a sinking ship causing panic. Nobody really practiced using them comprehensively. Nobody ran full evacuation drills. The crew had a brief lifeboat drill scheduled for the morning of April 14th, but it was cancelled for reasons that remain unclear. Possibly because the weather was nice and drills are boring. Who knows? The point is, when the actual emergency happened, many crew members had never actually lowered a lifeboat from those davits, had no clear evacuation procedures to follow, and were essentially improvising the entire rescue operation. It's like buying a fire extinguisher, never reading the instructions, and then being surprised when you can't figure out how to use it while your kitchen is actively on fire. The design philosophy extended beyond just the lifeboats and bulkheads. The entire ship reflected this weird contradiction between cutting-edge safety features and, well, not that safe though. Take the hull, for instance. Yes, it had a double bottom for protection against running aground, which was smart. But the double hull didn't extend up the sides of the ship, which would have protected against exactly the kind of side-scraping iceberg encounter that eventually happened. Why not? Cost and cargo space, mostly. A full double hull would have been more expensive and reduced the ship's carrying capacity. So they went with partial protection, the maritime equivalent of wearing a helmet but not a seatbelt. Sure, it'll help in some situations, but if you hit the wrong kind of problem, you're still in trouble. Even the steel used in the ship's construction, while high quality by 1912 standards, had properties that made it more brittle in cold water, something that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The rivets holding the hull plates together were a mix of steel and iron, with the weaker iron rivets used in the bow area where the iceberg would eventually tear through. This wasn't malicious. It was just standard construction practice using the best technology available at the time, but it meant the ship had structural vulnerabilities that nobody fully appreciated until it was too late. The builders thought they were using the best materials and methods available. They were, by contemporary standards. Those standards just weren't good enough for what the ship would face. There's a broader lesson hiding in all of this, and it's about what happens when marketing hype meets engineering reality, with insufficient skepticism in between. The White Star Line wasn't trying to build an unsafe ship. They genuinely believed they'd created something revolutionary and secure. The engineers weren't cutting corners maliciously. They were working within the constraints of budget, technology, and regulations that seemed adequate at the time. The problem was that everyone involved drank their own Kool-Aid. They believed the hype. They convinced themselves that technological progress had eliminated certain risks, or at least reduced them to near zero. And when you believe something is nearly impossible to sink, you make different decisions than when you acknowledge that anything can sink under the right circumstances. This is the fundamental mistake that underlies everything else, the assumption of invulnerability. It affected every subsequent decision, from the number of lifeboats to the crew training to the speed at which the ship would travel through known ice fields. When you start with the premise that the worst-case scenario can't happen, you don't prepare for the worst-case scenario. And then when it does happen, you're not just unprepared, you're catastrophically unprepared, because you've systematically removed or minimized the very safeguards that might have helped. The Titanic wasn't doomed by one single flaw. It was doomed by an entire culture of overconfidence that led to dozens of smaller decisions, each one defensible on its own, but collectively creating a perfect recipe for disaster. So when people ask how did the Titanic sink, the answer isn't just it hit an iceberg. It's it hit an iceberg because the people who designed, built and operated it believed so completely in their own technological superiority that they didn't think they needed to prepare for the possibility of failure. The iceberg was just the final exam they didn't know they were taking, testing every assumption and exposing every flaw that confidence had papered over. And as we're about to see, those flaws were numerous, consequential, and about to be revealed in the most tragic way possible. But the design flaws were only part of the problem. Because even with all those structural issues, the Titanic might have survived if the people operating it had made different decisions on the night of April 14th. And those decisions were heavily influenced by something that has doomed more ventures than bad engineering ever could: corporate pressure and the desperate need to look good in front of important people. Welcome to the part of the story where business incentives meet maritime safety. And spoiler alert, maritime safety loses badly. Here's the thing about the White Star Line. They were in a cutthroat competition with their main rival, Cunard Line, for dominance of the transatlantic passenger trade, and by 1912 they were losing. Cunard had ships like the Lusitania and Mauretania that were faster than anything White Star could field. These Cunard vessels regularly won the Blue Riband, this prestigious unofficial award for the fastest Atlantic crossing, and they were absolutely dominating the headlines in the luxury passenger market. White Star couldn't compete on pure speed. Their ships were built for comfort and luxury rather than velocity, so they pivoted to a different strategy. They'd build the biggest, most luxurious, most impressive ships anyone had ever seen. Ships so magnificent that wealthy passengers wouldn't care about shaving a few hours off the crossing time. The Titanic was the centerpiece of this strategy. The flagship that would prove White Star Line was still the premier choice for crossing the Atlantic. No pressure or anything. This meant that the Titanic's maiden voyage wasn't just a ship departure. It was a corporate PR event, a floating advertisement for White Star Line's technological prowess and luxury service. The passenger list read like a who's who of early 20th century wealth and influence. You had John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, Benjamin Guggenheim, mining magnate, Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. These weren't just passengers, they were walking testimonials, influencers before influencers were a thing. If they had a good experience and told their wealthy friends, it would be worth millions in future bookings. If anything went wrong, or if they were disappointed, it could torpedo, unfortunate word choice, the entire marketing strategy. The company needed this voyage to be perfect, smooth, impressive, and above all, fast enough to demonstrate that White Star ships were serious competition. Now enter Captain Edward John Smith, the man at the helm for this whole disaster in the making. Smith was 62 years old, a White Star Line veteran with decades of experience and an excellent safety record. He was known as the millionaire's captain, because wealthy passengers specifically requested to travel on ships under his command. He had a reputation for smooth, uneventful crossings, which is exactly what you want in a ship captain. Think of him as the opposite of a pilot who announces turbulence with, "Well, this should be interesting." Smith was scheduled to retire after the year Titanic's maiden voyage, going out on top with the crown jewel of the White Star fleet. It was supposed to be his grand finale, his curtain call, his mic drop moment. Instead, it became his epitaph, which is considerably less festive. The thing is, Smith was under enormous pressure, even if nobody was explicitly saying go faster or else. The pressure was implicit, baked into the entire situation. White Star executives were on board. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman and managing director of White Star Line, was literally sailing on the ship, breathing down everyone's neck. Having your boss's boss on your maiden voyage is like having your company's CEO shadow you on your first day at a new job. Technically, they're not telling you what to do, but you're absolutely aware of their presence and expectations every single moment. There are suggestions that Ismay was pushing for the ship to arrive in New York ahead of schedule, to make headlines and impress everyone with the Titanic's capabilities. Whether he explicitly pressured Smith or whether Smith just felt the implicit expectation doesn't really matter. The result was the same. The captain kept the ship running at near maximum speed through waters that were, as we're about to discuss, very clearly full of ice. And it wasn't just corporate pressure. There was also the matter of professional pride and maritime tradition. Ship captains in this era had a certain swagger about them, a confidence born from years of experience and technological progress. They'd been navigating the Atlantic for decades, and modern ships with their powerful engines and sophisticated navigation tools made it seem like they'd mastered the ocean. Ice warnings were common, but serious collisions were rare. The standard operating procedure was basically maintain speed and keep a sharp lookout. This had worked for years. Why would it suddenly stop working now? It's the same logic that makes people think they can drive in a snowstorm because they've done it before, right up until they're in a ditch wondering what went wrong. Smith had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times without incident. He'd dealt with ice before. He probably figured he knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, knowing what you're doing and actually doing the right thing aren't always the same thing. So the Titanic steamed ahead at about 22 knots, not quite full speed but close enough, through an area that multiple ships had warned contained ice. Which brings us to the next catastrophic failure in this sequence of bad decisions, the ice warnings themselves and the absolutely baffling way they were handled. Because if the design flaws were a problem and the speed was a problem, the fact that the ship had plenty of advance warning about the ice and basically ignored it elevates this whole situation from tragic accident to how did everyone involved not see this coming. On April 14th, 1912, the Titanic received at least 7 separate ice warnings from other ships in the area. Let me repeat that. 7 warnings. Not a vague, there might be ice somewhere, but specific, detailed reports with coordinates and descriptions of ice fields and icebergs. This wasn't a surprise attack by a rogue iceberg that came out of nowhere. This was multiple ships essentially sending up flares saying, "Heads up, this area is basically an ice cube factory. You might want to be careful." And the Titanic's response to these warnings can be summarized as "Thanks for the info, we'll keep that in mind," followed by continuing at high speed in the exact direction of the reported ice. It's like getting 7 different friends texting you there's a massive pothole on Main Street and you respond, "Cool, I'll take Main Street anyway," and then act shocked when you hit the pothole. Here's how the warning system failed, and it's a masterclass in poor communication and misaligned priorities. First, you need to understand that the Titanic had a Marconi wireless telegraph system, which was cutting-edge technology for 1912. It could send messages hundreds of miles, which was genuinely revolutionary. The problem was that the wireless operators, 2 guys named Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, didn't work for White Star Line. They worked for the Marconi Company, and their primary job wasn't navigation or safety. Their job was sending passenger messages. Rich people wanted to send telegrams to their friends and business associates, and every message sent meant revenue for Marconi. The wireless operators were essentially running a for-profit messaging service that happened to also sometimes handle navigation warnings. It's like if your GPS app was mainly focused on showing you ads and occasionally mentioned there was traffic ahead. Phillips and Bride were absolutely swamped with passenger traffic on April 14th. Everyone wanted to send messages, partially because the wireless system had broken down the day before and there was a backlog, and partially because rich passengers on a luxury liner just had a lot of messages to send. Having a wonderful time on the unsinkable ship, wish you were here, please wire more money, that sort of thing. The operators were working frantically to clear the backlog, which meant that when ice warnings came in, they were treated as interruptions to the real work of sending Mrs. Astor's telegram to New York. Some warnings made it to the bridge, some got posted in the chart room, and some just got acknowledged and then basically forgotten because the operators were too busy to properly route them to the officers who needed to see them. One particularly notable example, the ship Californian sent a warning late in the evening that they were stopped and surrounded by ice, directly in the Titanic's path. The Californian's message was so urgent that it basically shouted through the wireless set. Phillips, who was tired and stressed from hours of sending passenger messages, basically responded with, "Shut up, I'm busy," though in more professional telegraph terminology. He cut off the Californian's operator and went back to sending passenger telegrams. This wasn't malicious. Phillips was just overworked and prioritizing what he thought was his main job. Unfortunately, that particular warning might have prevented the entire disaster, but instead it got dismissed because someone wanted to tell their friend about the nice dinner they'd had. It's the Edwardian equivalent of missing a critical work email because you were too busy responding to spam. Even the warnings that did make it to the bridge didn't always result in appropriate action. Some were posted on a board in the chart room for officers to review, but there was no systematic process for incorporating them into navigation decisions. Captain Smith saw several warnings during the day and showed them to J. Bruce Ismay at one point, who casually put one in his pocket and carried it around for hours before returning it. Not exactly a system designed for optimal information flow. The warnings weren't all plotted on a chart in a way that would have shown the full picture of just how much ice was in the area. If someone had taken all 7 warnings and marked them on a single map, it would have been obvious that the Titanic was heading into a massive ice field with icebergs scattered throughout. But nobody did that systematic analysis. The warnings came in piecemeal, were handled individually without coordination, and never cohered into a comprehensive understanding of the danger. There's also the question of what the officers on the bridge thought about the ice situation. They knew there was ice ahead. That much was clear from the warnings, but they also believed that they could see icebergs in time to avoid them. This was standard practice: maintain speed, post extra lookouts, and trust that experienced eyes would spot danger before it became a problem. The conditions that night seemed fine for this approach. The sea was dead calm, which meant lookouts could spot ice by watching for waves breaking against it. Except there was no moon, which meant visibility was limited to what the starlight provided. And there was no wind, which meant no waves, which meant no white foam to mark where icebergs sat in the dark water. The conditions were actually the worst possible for ice detection, but nobody on the bridge seemed to fully appreciate just how difficult it would be to see a black iceberg against a black ocean on a moonless night. They were flying blind at 22 knots and didn't realize it. There's this fascinating cognitive bias at work here that shows up repeatedly in disasters, normalization of deviance. Basically, when you do something risky and nothing bad happens, you start to think it's not actually risky. Ship captains had been running at speed through ice warnings for years without hitting anything, so it became normal procedure. The fact that it was actually extremely dangerous just hadn't manifested in a disaster yet. Everyone thought they'd found a safe way to navigate ice fields quickly, when really they'd just been incredibly lucky multiple times and mistaken luck for skill. It's like texting while driving and not crashing. The lack of immediate consequences makes you think you're good at it, when really you're just good at being fortunate, until suddenly you're not. The whole system was set up for failure. You had corporate pressure to make good time. You had a captain who was confident in his abilities and following standard industry practice. You had wireless operators who were overworked and prioritizing the wrong messages. You had officers who knew about ice but didn't have a clear picture of just how much ice. You had lookouts without binoculars. Yes, that's a whole other problem we'll get to, trying to spot dark ice against dark water on a dark night. And you had a culture that assumed modern ships and experienced crews had maritime safety figured out, when really they were one bad night away from proving they absolutely did not. Every ship in the area was receiving the same ice warnings. The Californians stopped for the night because their captain decided it was too dangerous to proceed in the dark through ice fields. Other ships slowed down or altered course. The Titanic just kept going, maintained speed, and trusted that everything would work out because it always had before. This is what happens when confidence, corporate pressure, poor communication, and normalcy, bias all converge on one ship on one night. The ice warnings weren't ignored because anyone was incompetent or evil. They were ignored because the entire system was structured in a way that allowed critical safety information to be deprioritized in favor of other considerations like passenger, service, schedule adherence, and not looking overly cautious in front of company executives. And so the Titanic steamed ahead into the night, fully warned and almost completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The ship that couldn't sink was about to test that theory in the most catastrophic way possible, and all the warning signs that might have prevented it had been systematically overlooked, dismissed, or lost in the noise of business as usual. Sometimes the disaster isn't what hits you, it's all the things you ignored on your way to getting hit. Now, you might think that with all these design problems and communication failures, at least the crew would be exceptionally well trained to handle emergencies. Compensating for the ship's flaws with human excellence and rigorous preparation, and you would be adorably optimistic but completely wrong. Because the human element of this disaster is somehow even more of a mess than the engineering and communication issues, which is honestly impressive in the worst possible way. Let's start with what might be the single most absurd detail in this entire catastrophe. A plot point so ridiculous that if you saw it in a movie, you'd roll your eyes and say, "Come on, that's too convenient." The lookouts in the crow's nest, the guys, whose literal only job was to spot dangers ahead of the ship, didn't have binoculars. Not because binoculars hadn't been invented yet, and not because the ship didn't have binoculars. The ship absolutely had binoculars. They were locked in a cabinet, and the key to that cabinet had left the ship with an officer who got reassigned at the last minute. Let me repeat that in case you thought you misheard. The people responsible for seeing icebergs in the dark couldn't access the one tool that would have helped them see icebergs in the dark because of a key. A key. More than 1,500 people died partially because someone forgot to hand over a key. It's like having a fire extinguisher behind a locked glass case and then losing the little hammer, except the consequences are monumentally worse. Here's how that particular circus of incompetence happened. There was an officer named David Blair who was originally assigned to the Titanic, but got bumped at the last minute when White Star Line decided to reassign another officer, named Henry Wilde, to the ship instead. This reshuffling was apparently done to put more experienced officers on the maiden voyage, which seems reasonable until you realise it created a cascade of problems. Blair left the ship in Southampton on April 9th, took his personal belongings with him, and apparently either forgot he had the key to the binocular locker or didn't think it was important enough to hand over to someone. The binoculars stayed locked away and nobody thought to, I don't know, break the lock, find another key, buy new binoculars in Southampton. Apparently not. The lookouts just had to rely on their naked eyesight, which for spotting dark objects against dark water on a moonless night is about as effective as using a flashlight to look for darkness. Frederick Fleet, one of the lookouts on duty the night of the collision, later testified that if they'd had binoculars, they probably would have seen the iceberg sooner. How much sooner? Enough to avoid it? We'll never know for certain, but the point is that a basic piece of safety equipment was unavailable because of bureaucratic bungling, and nobody thought it was worth solving the problem. This is what happens when you run a ship with the organisational skills of a community theatre production. Everyone's trying their best, but nobody's quite sure what they're supposed to be doing, and half the props are in the wrong place. But the binocular situation was just one symptom of a much larger problem. The crew wasn't adequately trained for emergencies, and many of them had never worked together before. The Titanic's crew was a mix of experienced White Star Line veterans and people who'd just been hired for this voyage. They'd had essentially no time to train together as a cohesive unit. There was supposed to be a lifeboat drill on the morning of April 14th, literally the day of the disaster, but it was cancelled. Why? Nobody's entirely sure. Some sources suggest Captain Smith cancelled it because he wanted to attend church services instead, which if true is a spectacular example of prioritisation failure. Others suggest it was just considered unnecessary because everyone assumed they knew what they were doing. Either way, the one opportunity to practice the procedures that would become critically important that very night got skipped. It's like cancelling a fire drill because you're confident there won't be a fire, and then being shocked when the building burns down and nobody knows where the exits are. The crew's lack of training became catastrophically obvious during the evacuation. Many crew members had never actually lowered a lifeboat from the davits before. They knew the theory, maybe, but theory and practice are two very different things when you're trying to work mechanical equipment in the dark on a tilting ship with hundreds of panicked people around you. Some boats were lowered unevenly because the crew couldn't coordinate both ends properly. Others got stuck partway down and had to be fixed while dangling over the ocean. The whole operation should have been smooth and practiced, something the crew could do in their sleep. Instead, it was chaos managed by people who were learning on the job during the worst possible learning environment. It's the equivalent of your first day at a new job being the day the entire computer system crashes and someone expects you to fix it despite never having seen the server room before. And it wasn't just the lifeboat operation that was a mess. The crew didn't have clear standardized procedures for dealing with emergencies. Different officers interpreted orders differently. There was confusion about who was in charge of what. Communication between the bridge and the boat deck wasn't systematic. Nobody had practiced coordinating a mass evacuation of over 2,000 people in the dark. Why would they? The ship was unsinkable, remember? Planning for a sinking would be like planning for the sun not to rise, a waste of time and possibly bad luck. Except the sun rises every day, and ships definitely can sink, so maybe the planning would have been worthwhile after all. There's also the matter of crew fatigue, which is less dramatic than the binocular situation but equally important. The crew had been working long shifts because that's just how shipping worked in 1912. Nobody had really figured out that tired people make more mistakes, or if they had figured it out, they didn't care because labour was cheap and worker fatigue was the employee's problem, not management's. The lookouts were on 4-hour shifts, which doesn't sound too bad until you remember they were staring into darkness trying to spot subtle differences in darkness, which is mentally exhausting even when you're well rested. The officers were on duty for extended periods with minimal sleep. The wireless operators had been working frantically for hours dealing with the passenger message backlog. Everyone was running on fumes, making judgment calls while tired, which is how you get decisions like, let's keep going at full speed through an ice field, or, sure, let's skip the safety drill. The crew roster itself was a problem. The Titanic needed 885 crew members to operate, and they'd hired them from all over. Some were experienced White Star Line employees who'd worked together before. Others were new hires who'd literally just signed on for this voyage. Imagine trying to run a complex operation with a team where half the people don't know each other's names, haven't worked together before, and are operating equipment they've maybe used once or twice. It's like assembling a professional sports team the day before the championship game and expecting them to play like they've been training together for years. You might have talented individuals, but you don't have a cohesive unit that can function smoothly under pressure. The third-class crew situation was particularly chaotic. The stewards and stewardesses responsible for third-class passengers were spread thin, didn't have clear evacuation procedures, and in many cases couldn't speak the same languages as the passengers they were supposed to be helping. The third-class sections were a maze of corridors and stairways, and many crew members didn't know the layout well enough to efficiently guide passengers to the boat deck. When the evacuation started, some third-class passengers couldn't even find their way to the upper decks because the routes were unfamiliar and some gates were locked, ostensibly for immigration control purposes, but practically creating death traps. The crew members who should have been helping them navigate were often just as confused about where to go. It's like being a tour guide in a building you've never fully explored during an emergency with people who don't speak your language and need you to lead them to safety. Not exactly a recipe for success. There's also the uncomfortable reality that class segregation extended to safety procedures. The first-class crew knew every inch of their territory, had worked on luxury liners before and were drilled on providing excellent service to demanding passengers. The third-class crew were newer, less trained, and working in less prestigious positions with fewer resources. When the emergency happened, this disparity in training and resources translated directly into survival rates. First-class passengers had crew members who knew exactly how to get them to the boat deck. Third-class passengers had crew members who were often just as lost and panicked as they were. The ship might have been segregated by class for social reasons, but that segregation became a matter of life and death when the ship started sinking. Then there's the matter of the crew's understanding of the equipment they were supposed to use. Those davits we mentioned earlier, the mechanical arms that lower the lifeboats, were a new design. They were actually pretty clever engineering, capable of lowering boats smoothly and safely when operated correctly. The key phrase being when operated correctly. Many crew members hadn't been properly trained on this new system. They were more familiar with older davit designs, and the differences were enough to cause problems. It's like upgrading from a manual transmission to an automatic and then being thrown into a high-speed chase. The basic principles are similar, but if you don't know the specifics, you're going to have problems. Some boats were lowered too quickly, others too slowly. Some got stuck because the operators didn't know how to release the brake mechanism properly. The equipment was fine. The human knowledge of how to use it was lacking. Communication within the crew was also a disaster waiting to happen. The ship didn't have a public address system, or any way to quickly communicate with everyone on board simultaneously. Information had to be passed person to person, which in a crisis situation is about as reliable as a game of telephone played by people who are panicking. Orders from the bridge took minutes to reach different parts of the ship. Instructions got garbled in translation. Different crew members received different information and acted on what they thought they'd heard. Some crew members were telling passengers there was nothing to worry about, even while other crew members were frantically loading lifeboats. The lack of a centralized communication system meant that coordinating a complex emergency response was nearly impossible, like trying to conduct an orchestra where the musicians can't hear the conductor and are all playing from different sheets of music. And here's a detail that really highlights the organizational mess. Many crew members didn't know where safety equipment was stored. Life jackets were scattered in various lockers and cabins, but not everyone knew where to find them or how to distribute them efficiently. Flares and emergency supplies weren't clearly marked or easily accessible. The distress rockets used to signal other ships weren't even stored in a logical location. They had to be brought up from storage, which took valuable time. It's like having a first aid kit in your house but forgetting where you put it, except instead of treating a minor cut, you're trying to save thousands of lives. The equipment existed, but the institutional knowledge of where everything was and how to deploy it was scattered across too many individual crew members who hadn't had time to coordinate. The whole situation was a perfect storm of human factors working against survival. You had inadequate training combined with insufficient practice, unclear procedures meeting organizational chaos, fatigue mixing with stress, and a crew structure that prioritized luxury service over emergency preparedness. Layer on top of that the fact that most crew members genuinely believed the ship couldn't sink, so why prepare for an impossible scenario, and you get a recipe for catastrophe. When the emergency actually happened, the crew did their best with what they had, and many performed heroically under impossible circumstances. But their best wasn't good enough because they'd been set up to fail, by a system that never properly prepared them for the very emergency they were now facing. This is what happens when you assume technology and engineering will solve all problems, so human preparation becomes an afterthought. The Titanic had state-of-the-art equipment, but a 19th century approach to crew training and emergency procedures. It had the latest safety technology, but forgot that technology only works if the humans operating it know what they're doing and have practiced doing it. All the watertight compartments and lifeboats in the world don't help if your crew doesn't know how to use them effectively, and the Titanic's crew was learning how to run an emergency evacuation in real time, during an actual emergency, which is absolutely not how you want that learning process to happen. The human factor didn't just contribute to the disaster. In many ways, it guaranteed that even with advance warning and adequate equipment, the response would be chaotic and insufficient. And we haven't even gotten to the actual collision yet. So now we arrive at the night itself, April 14th, 1912, when all of those accumulated mistakes, overlooked warnings, design flaws and training deficiencies converged into one catastrophic moment. And here's the thing that makes this night particularly terrifying from a maritime perspective. The conditions were absolutely perfect for not seeing an iceberg until it was way too late. Not stormy, not chaotic, not dramatic. Just quietly, perfectly, lethally calm. Let me paint you a picture of what the ocean looked like that night, because it's important to understand just how unlucky the conditions were. The sea was what sailors call glassy calm, absolutely flat, no waves whatsoever. Normally this would be considered ideal sailing weather, the kind of conditions you'd brag about to other captains over drinks. Smooth crossing, happy passengers, no seasickness, everyone enjoying the voyage. Except when you're looking for icebergs, calm water is your worst enemy. See, normally you can spot icebergs at night by watching for waves breaking against them, creating white foam that shows up in the darkness. It's like having a natural highlighting system, where the ocean helpfully outlines the dangers for you. But on April 14th, there were no waves. Zero. The ocean was so still it looked like someone had poured glass over the Atlantic, which meant icebergs were just dark shapes floating in dark water, practically invisible. And it gets worse, because of course it does. There was no moon that night. The moon had set hours earlier, so the only light came from stars, which sounds romantic in poetry, but is absolutely useless for navigation when you're trying to spot potential ship killers in the water. Modern people don't really appreciate how dark actual darkness is because we've got streetlights and cities and light pollution everywhere. But out in the middle of the ocean, on a moonless night in 1912, that's darkness that city dwellers can't even imagine. The kind of dark where you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face if you're away from the ship's lights. The Titanic was steaming through this darkness at 22 knots, which is about 25 miles per hour, which doesn't sound that fast until you remember this is a 46,000-ton ship with the stopping distance of a small city. It's like driving a loaded semi-truck at highway speed through a pitch-black tunnel with your headlights off. Technically possible, but requiring either tremendous luck or tremendous stupidity, and the Titanic was rapidly running out of luck. The lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, the two guys with arguably the most important job on the ship that night, were basically trying to spot dark ice against dark water under dark skies. And remember, they didn't have those binoculars because of the key situation we discussed earlier. They just had their eyes, the starlight, and the hope that they'd see something before it became a problem. It's like being asked to find a black cat in a dark room, except the cat weighs several thousand tons and will kill you if you don't find it fast enough. The lookouts knew there was ice in the area. They'd been told to keep a sharp watch for it. But keeping a sharp watch is a lot easier said than done when visibility is essentially zero and your primary detection tool is locked in a cabinet somewhere. Now here's where we need to talk about First Officer William Murdoch, because this guy is about to make a split-second decision that will be debated by maritime experts for over a century. Murdoch was on duty on the bridge that night, in charge of the ship while Captain Smith was presumably sleeping, or doing whatever captains do when they're not actively steering. Murdoch was experienced, competent, and by all accounts a good officer. He was also about to face a situation that no amount of training or experience could have fully prepared him for, because the Titanic had never practiced emergency collision avoidance at speed. Why would they? The ship was unsinkable, remember? So when the moment came, Murdoch would have to rely on instinct, standard procedure, and whatever decisions his brain could make in the approximately 30 seconds between oh no and impact. At 11:39 p.m., Frederick Fleet in the crow's nest spotted something ahead. In the absolute darkness, it appeared as a darker shape against the dark horizon, which is not a lot to work with, but it was enough to trigger every alarm bell in Fleet's experienced sailor brain. He grabbed the warning bell and rang it 3 times, the signal for object directly ahead. Then he picked up the telephone to the bridge and delivered what might be the most understated warning in maritime disaster history. Iceberg, right ahead. Not giant floating death mountain directly in our path, just a calm, professional iceberg right ahead, like he was reporting the time or the weather. To be fair to Fleet, panic wouldn't have helped anything, but the casual delivery belies the absolute terror that must have been going through his mind as he watched this massive ice formation loom out of the darkness. On the bridge, 6th Officer James Moody took the call and immediately relayed it to 1st Officer Murdoch. And this is where things get interesting from a what-if perspective, because Murdoch had maybe 37 seconds from the moment of Fleet's warning to impact. 37 seconds. Take a moment to count that out. That's barely enough time to process what you've heard, make a decision, and execute it. Murdoch had to figure out the best course of action for avoiding a collision with an iceberg he couldn't clearly see yet, in a ship that responds to steering like a heavily loaded shopping cart with a broken wheel. What he decided to do would determine whether the Titanic survived the night or became history's most famous maritime disaster. Murdoch's decision was to order harder starboard, which confusingly means turn the ship to port left because of the way steering orders worked in 1912, and simultaneously telegraph the engine room to throw the engines into full reverse. This was essentially the standard evasive maneuver taught to ship's officers: turn away from the danger and try to stop. It's what you'd instinctively do if you suddenly saw an obstacle while driving: swerve and brake. Reasonable, right? Except here's the problem. This might have been exactly the wrong thing to do, and we're still not entirely sure. See, when you order a ship to reverse engines while simultaneously trying to turn, you're creating competing priorities for the physics involved. The propellers that give you steering power are now churning in the opposite direction, which reduces your maneuverability right when you need it most. Some maritime experts have argued that if Murdoch had either just turned hard without reversing, or just reversed without turning, the ship might have avoided the iceberg entirely, or at least reduced the damage. Just turning would have allowed the rudder to work more effectively and might have swung the bow clear. Just reversing might have slowed the ship enough to reduce impact damage. Trying to do both meant doing neither thing particularly well. It's like trying to parallel park while also flooring the gas. The car doesn't know what you want it to do, so it does everything badly. But we need to be fair to Murdoch here, because he was making this decision in real time with incomplete information and the weight of 2,200 lives on his shoulders. He couldn't run computer simulations or consult with experts. He had to act immediately based on his training and instincts, and his training told him to do what he did. The fact that it might have been suboptimal doesn't make him incompetent. It makes him human, trying his best in an impossible situation with no good options and no time to evaluate alternatives. Armchair quarterbacking is easy when you have a century of hindsight and access to detailed physics simulations. In the moment, on the bridge, in the dark, Murdoch did what he thought was right. It's just that right wasn't enough. The ship began to turn. Slowly. So slowly. Because here's a fun fact about 46,000-ton vessels travelling at 22 knots. They don't exactly respond like sports cars. The Titanic's turning radius was enormous, and the ship took forever to change direction. Murdoch could probably feel every second ticking by, watching the bow slowly start to swing to port while the iceberg got closer and closer. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee could only watch as the ship gradually turned while the iceberg loomed larger. It must have been absolutely surreal, this slow-motion race between the ship's turning speed and the rapidly decreasing distance to the ice. Like watching a car accident happen in super slow motion, knowing it's inevitable but unable to do anything except watch. For a brief moment it looked like it might work. The bow started to clear the iceberg. If the ship had been just slightly faster in responding, or if Fleet had spotted the ice just a few seconds earlier, or if the sea had been choppy enough to see the ice sooner, the Titanic might have slipped past with feet to spare. Ships and icebergs have near misses all the time. This could have been one of them, a story Murdoch would tell in bars for years about the time he nearly hit ice in the Atlantic and expertly avoided disaster. Instead, it became the story of the time he tried to avoid ice and created the conditions for the worst maritime disaster of the era. The bow swung clear. For a moment, that must have seemed like success. But the Titanic was 882 feet long, and just because the front of the ship avoided direct impact doesn't mean the whole ship was safe. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the hull below the waterline, creating a series of openings that let water flood into the supposedly watertight compartments. It wasn't a dramatic collision. Many passengers barely noticed it. Some described it as a grinding sound, others as a slight shudder. Up on deck, chunks of ice fell onto the forward well deck, which some passengers found amusing. "Oh, look! Free ice for the drinks." Not exactly the level of alarm you'd expect from a fatal collision. Nobody was screaming or panicking because it didn't seem that serious. The ship was still moving, still lit up, still functioning normally. The band was still playing in the lounge. People were still enjoying their evening. It was the most anticlimactic apocalypse imaginable. But down below, in the parts of the ship that passengers couldn't see, water was pouring in. Not everywhere, not dramatically, but steadily and unstoppably into multiple compartments. The collision had created openings along about 300 feet of the hull, not a continuous gash as some popular depictions show, but a series of separated tiers and buckled seams that collectively amounted to about 12 square feet of openings. That doesn't sound like much, does it? 12 square feet could fit in your living room, but 12 square feet of openings below the waterline on a ship travelling at speed means water flooding in at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. And once that water gets in, it doesn't leave. Physics doesn't care about corporate branding or engineering confidence. The rivets that held the hull plates together weren't strong enough to resist the stress of the collision. Some popped out, some bent, some held, but the plates around them buckled. The impact wasn't forceful enough to create a dramatic hole. It was just forceful enough to compromise the hull's integrity in multiple places. It's like the difference between smashing a window and carefully creating lots of small cracks that let water seep through. The end result is the same, but the process is less obvious. If the collision had been more dramatic, maybe people would have realized the danger immediately. Instead, the subtle nature of the damage led to a fatal delay in understanding how serious the situation was. Thomas Andrews, the ship's builder who was on board for the maiden voyage, quickly inspected the damage and realized what Murdoch and the other officers were about to learn. The ship was doomed. 6 compartments were flooding. The Titanic could survive 4 compartments flooding, maybe, but 6 was beyond its design capacity. The water would fill the forward compartments, dragging the bow down, which would cause water to spill over the tops of the bulkheads into the next compartments, creating a progressive flooding situation that couldn't be stopped. Andrews did the calculations and gave the ship 2 hours, maybe less. It's one thing to know intellectually that a ship can sink. It's another thing entirely to stand on that ship, watch water flooding in, do the math, and realize you're standing on a ticking clock counting down to disaster. Up on the bridge, the full implications of what had just happened were starting to sink in, if you'll pardon the expression. The collision that had seemed so minor that barely anyone had noticed, that some passengers had actually found amusing, had just condemned the largest moving object ever built by humans. All those design choices, all that corporate hubris, all those ignored warnings, all that inadequate training, it all came together in one moment of contact between ice and steel. The unsinkable ship had been sunk by a problem so pedestrian, so straightforward, so utterly predictable that it's almost insulting. Not a freak storm, not a rogue wave, not some bizarre technical failure. Just ice. Just a big chunk of frozen water floating in the ocean, doing what chunks of frozen water do, having absolutely no respect for human engineering or marketing campaigns. And here's the truly frustrating part. If any one thing had been different, the disaster might have been avoided or minimized. If they'd slowed down when entering the ice field, if the lookouts had had their binoculars, if Fleet had spotted the ice 10 seconds earlier, if Murdoch had made a different steering decision, if the sea had been choppy enough to see the ice sooner, if the moon had been out, if the ship had been designed with higher bulkheads, if there had been more lifeboats, any single change in this chain of failures might have broken the sequence and prevented the catastrophe. But instead, every single factor aligned perfectly for disaster. It's like watching dominoes fall in the worst possible way, except each domino is a human error or unfortunate circumstance, and the last domino is 1,500 people dying in the North Atlantic. The collision happened at 11:40 p.m. In less than 3 hours, the Titanic would be on the bottom of the ocean. The crew would discover just how inadequate their training was. The passengers would discover just how inadequate the lifeboat provision was. The world would discover that unsinkable was marketing, not reality. And it all came down to those 37 seconds between Fleet's warning and the impact that changed everything. Those critical moments when the gap between what the ship needed to do and what it was capable of doing proved fatal. Sometimes disasters happen because of one catastrophic failure. The Titanic disaster happened because of dozens of smaller failures, all cascading together in exactly the wrong sequence at exactly the wrong time. And there's a lesson in that about overconfidence, under-preparation, and the difference between what we think is impossible and what physics knows is absolutely possible. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, most people on the Titanic had absolutely no idea they were in mortal danger. And I mean absolutely no idea. This wasn't a dramatic Hollywood moment with alarms blaring and people running around screaming. This was more like a minor inconvenience that briefly interrupted the evening entertainment. Some passengers felt a slight vibration. Others heard a grinding noise that was easily dismissed as the ship's engines doing something weird. A few people noticed chunks of ice landing on the forward deck and thought it was interesting, maybe even fun. "Oh, look, honey, ice. How novel." Not exactly the reaction you'd expect to the opening act of history's most famous maritime disaster. Many passengers were already in bed and slept right through it. Think about that for a second. The collision that doomed the Titanic wasn't forceful enough to wake people up. It's like if your house started burning down but the fire alarm was too polite to wake you. Down in third class, some passengers actually played with the ice that had fallen on deck, tossing it around like snowballs, completely oblivious to the fact that this ice had just signed their death warrant. Up in first class, people barely noticed anything at all. The band kept playing, the bar stayed open. People continued their conversations about whatever rich people in 1912 talked about. Stocks, mansions, the help. Who knows? The entire ship just kept functioning like nothing had happened, which would be fine if nothing had actually happened, but something very definitely had happened and nobody seemed particularly concerned about it. But down in the bowels of the ship, where passengers couldn't see and most didn't think about, the situation was considerably less casual. Water was pouring in through those openings we discussed earlier, flooding the mailroom, the squash court, the cargo holds, and multiple boiler rooms. The postal workers tried to save the mail, dragging sacks up to higher decks in a futile attempt to keep correspondence dry, which is dedication to customer service that goes way beyond the call of duty. The ship might be sinking, but by God, Mrs. Henderson in Philadelphia is getting her letter. The firemen and stokers in the flooded boiler rooms had to evacuate as seawater rushed in and started mixing with the furnaces, creating steam and chaos and conditions that were absolutely not covered. In the employee handbook, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, went down to inspect the damage together. This must have been a surreal experience for Andrews, walking through his creation, seeing his design being tested in the worst possible way, knowing immediately that it was failing. Andrews was intimately familiar with every aspect of the ship's construction. He knew exactly how the watertight compartments were supposed to work, what the ship could survive, and most importantly, what it couldn't survive. As they examined the flooding, counting which compartments were taking on water, Andrews was doing the math in his head. And the math was not encouraging. See, the ship's design allowed it to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments. This was considered a generous safety margin because what are the odds of flooding more than 4 compartments? Well, as it turns out, the odds were pretty good if you hit an iceberg at exactly the wrong angle, while travelling at 22 knots. The collision had compromised 6 compartments. 6. The ship was basically doomed by a margin of 2 compartments, which in hindsight seems like a pretty slim safety buffer for something marketed as unsinkable. It's like building a dam that can handle 4 feet of water and then being surprised when 5 feet causes problems. The margin between "we're fine" and "we're all going to die" was narrower than anyone had planned for. Andrews did the calculations based on the rate of flooding and the ship's displacement. He concluded that the Titanic had maybe 2 hours, possibly less. The bow was already noticeably lower in the water, which meant the forward compartments were filling fast. As they filled, the weight would pull the bow down further, which would eventually cause water to spill over the tops of those incomplete bulkheads into the next compartments, which would pull the bow down even more, creating a cascade of flooding. That couldn't be stopped. It was a death spiral, and once it started, there was no way to reverse it. Andrews reportedly told Captain Smith 2 hours, perhaps an hour and a half. She's going down by the head. Not she might sink, or this could be serious. Just a straight-up deadline. The unsinkable ship had roughly 90 to 120 minutes left to float, and every second of that time was precious. Here's where the really frustrating part begins, because there was a critical delay between understanding that the ship was doomed and taking decisive action to save lives. Some of this delay was shock. Nobody really wanted to believe that the magnificent Titanic was actually going to sink. Some of it was the sheer logistics of organising an evacuation of over 2,000 people in the dark, in the middle of the ocean, with inadequate lifeboats and undertrained crew. And some of it was just the human tendency to hope things aren't as bad as they seem, to wait and see if maybe the situation will improve. Spoiler, it didn't improve. It got worse at a predictable and measurable rate, but the human brain really doesn't want to accept that a floating city can sink in 2 hours. Captain Smith ordered the crew to start preparing the lifeboats, but even this order wasn't executed with the urgency you might expect. The crew started uncovering the boats, loading provisions, preparing the davits, all important steps, but done at a pace that suggested they had time to spare. Nobody was rushing, nobody was panicking. It was all very orderly and British and completely inadequate for the situation at hand. It's like calmly organising your belongings while your house burns down instead of just running out the door. The crew's training and instincts told them to maintain order and calm, which is normally good advice, but there's a difference between calm and efficient and calm and lethally slow. Meanwhile, most passengers still had no idea anything serious was happening. The ship hadn't listed noticeably yet. The lights were still on. Everything looked normal. When crew members started telling passengers to put on life jackets and head to the boat deck, many people thought it was a drill or an overreaction. Some refused to put on life jackets because they were bulky and uncomfortable. Others went to the boat deck, looked at the dark, cold ocean, looked at the warm, well-lit ship, and decided they'd rather stay on the ship, thank you very much. The idea of getting into a small wooden boat and being lowered 70 feet into the freezing Atlantic while the big, safe ship was right there seemed ridiculous. It's like refusing to evacuate a building during a fire drill because you're warm and comfortable inside. Except this wasn't a drill, and the building was absolutely going to collapse. The evacuation itself was a masterclass in how not to organise an emergency response. There was no comprehensive plan, no clear chain of command, no established procedures that everyone knew and had practiced. Different officers interpreted the women and children first protocol in different ways, creating confusion and inconsistency. Some officers, like Second Officer Charles Lightoller, interpreted it as women and children only. He actively prevented men from boarding lifeboats even when there were empty seats. Other officers interpreted it as women and children first, but men can board if there's room. This meant that depending on which lifeboat you approached and which officer was in charge, you might be allowed on or turned away based on arbitrary interpretation of a vague protocol. It's the emergency evacuation equivalent of different teachers having different rules for the same test. Frustrating in school, fatal on a sinking ship. The result was that many lifeboats left the ship half empty. The first lifeboat to launch, Lifeboat 7, had a capacity of 65 people. It left with 28. That's not even half full. Lifeboat 1 was designed for 40 people and left with 12. 12? That's not a lifeboat, that's a carpool. Overall, the lifeboats had a total capacity of about 1,178 people, and they left the Titanic carrying only around 705. That means roughly 400 seats went to waste, representing 400 people who could have been saved but weren't because of poor planning, miscommunication, and officers who were either too cautious about overloading boats or too rigid in their interpretation of passenger priority. There were multiple reasons for this catastrophic inefficiency. First, the officers genuinely weren't sure how much weight the lifeboats could handle. They'd never been fully loaded in testing, and nobody wanted to be the officer who overloaded a boat and caused it to capsize or break apart on the way down. So they erred on the side of caution, which in this context meant sending half-empty boats away while people who could have been saved remained on the ship. It's the safety paradox, being too cautious about immediate safety while ignoring the bigger picture of overall survival, like refusing to break a window to escape a burning building because you might get cut on the glass. Second, many passengers simply didn't want to get in the boats. The Titanic still looked safe. It was brightly lit, warm, stable. The boats looked small, dark and vulnerable. Getting into a lifeboat meant acknowledging that the ship was really sinking, which many people weren't ready to accept. Some women refused to leave without their husbands. Some families refused to be separated. Some men refused to take spots that they thought should go to women and children, even when officers were trying to get men to board to fill empty seats. The whole situation was complicated by class distinctions, language barriers, confusion, and the very human tendency to freeze when faced with a crisis you don't fully understand. Third, the crew loading the boats wasn't consistent in their approach. Some officers loaded from the boat deck, others from the promenade deck below. Some allowed men to board, others didn't. Some boats were properly filled, others weren't. There was no systematic process, no coordination between loading stations, no communication about how many people were in each boat or how many boats had left. It was organised chaos at best, complete confusion at worst. Imagine trying to organise an orderly evacuation of a large building with no fire exit signs, no evacuation maps, no PA system, and half the staff speaking different languages with different ideas about the procedure. That's basically what happened on the Titanic. The women and children first protocol itself, while well-intentioned, created moral dilemmas and practical problems. Families were torn apart as men were forced to stay behind while their wives and children boarded boats. Some men snuck into boats anyway, hiding under seats or disguising themselves in women's clothing, desperate measures from desperate people. Officers sometimes had to threaten men with guns to maintain order and prevent the boats from being rushed. It's one of those situations where there are no good options, only different degrees of awful. Let everyone rush the boats and risk capsizing them, or maintain order through force and potentially separate families forever. Neither option is acceptable, but officers had to choose in real time while the ship literally sank beneath their feet. There's also the uncomfortable reality that class played a role in survival rates. First-class passengers were closer to the boat deck, had better information about what was happening, and were more likely to be helped by crew members. Third-class passengers were deep in the ship, far from the lifeboats, often behind locked gates, and many didn't speak English well enough to understand instructions. By the time many third-class passengers realised they needed to get to the boat deck, most of the lifeboats were gone. It's a grim reminder that even in a democracy of disaster, some people had better access to survival resources than others. As more boats launched and the ship's list became more pronounced, panic started to set in. People began to realise this wasn't a drill or an overreaction. The ship was actually going down, and the lifeboats were running out. The calm, orderly evacuation started to break down. Some people rushed toward remaining boats. Others jumped into the water, hoping to swim to boats already in the water. The crew fired warning shots to maintain order. The whole situation devolved from stiff upper lip British orderliness to barely controlled chaos in the space of about an hour. And through it all, boats that could have saved more people sat half empty in the water, rowing away from the ship, their passengers watching in horror as the realization hit. We're safe, but we left people behind, and there's nothing we can do about it now. The last lifeboat to leave in the traditional way, Collapsible D, departed at 2:05 a.m., just 15 minutes before the ship sank. By that point, hundreds of people were still on board with no way off except into the freezing water. The boats could have saved 1,178 people, but only saved 705, meaning that approximately 473 seats went unused while people died. That's not a rounding error. That's a preventable tragedy within a tragedy. If the evacuation had been better organised, if the crew had been better trained, if the officers had been more aggressive about filling boats, if passengers had been more willing to board early, hundreds more people would have survived. Instead, they died because of inefficiency, confusion, and the fatal combination of overconfidence in the ship's safety and underestimation of how quickly the situation would deteriorate. The evacuation of the Titanic stands as a case study in how crisis management can fail even when you have the resources to save people. The boats existed, the capacity was there. What was missing was the organisation, training, communication and urgency to use those resources effectively. It's a reminder that having safety equipment isn't enough. You need to know how to deploy it, you need people trained to use it, and you need procedures that work under pressure. The Titanic's crew tried their best with what they had, but their best wasn't good enough because the system had set them up to fail. And the price of that failure was paid by the people who died in the water, or went down with the ship, including many who should have, been in those empty lifeboat seats rowing away to safety. Now, here's where the tragedy gets even more frustrating, because while the Titanic was sinking and launching half-empty lifeboats into the Atlantic, there was another ship close enough to potentially save everyone, and I mean everyone. Close enough that the Titanic's crew could see its lights on the horizon. Close enough that if that ship had responded to distress signals, we might be telling a very different story right now. Instead, we're telling the story of one of history's most maddening missed opportunities, featuring a ship called the Californian and a captain whose decision-making that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Californian was a British cargo ship under the command of Captain Stanley Lord. On the night of April 14th, the Californian had stopped for the night because Captain Lord, unlike Captain Smith on the Titanic, had looked at all the ice warnings, looked at the darkness, looked at the ice field they were approaching, and made the sensible decision to just stop and wait until morning. Revolutionary concept, right? Don't steam full speed through dangerous ice fields in the dark. Lord dropped anchor and settled in for the night, probably feeling pretty good about his cautious decision-making. Little did he know that this same caution would later be twisted into a reputation-destroying controversy that would follow him to his grave. The Californian was somewhere between 10 and 20 miles from the Titanic when the collision happened. The exact distance is still debated by historians and maritime experts, but the important thing is that they were close, really close. Close enough to potentially reach the Titanic in time to save hundreds, or possibly all of the people who ended up dying in the water. The Californian's crew could see lights on the horizon that almost certainly belonged to the Titanic. The Titanic's crew could see lights that almost certainly belonged to the Californian. They were within visual range of each other, separated by a stretch of dark ocean that a ship could cross in less than an hour if it started moving. But the Californian didn't move, and that non-movement is one of the great what-if moments in maritime history. Here's what happened on the Californian that night, and it's a comedy of errors that would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. The ship's wireless operator, a guy named Cyril Evans, had been working all day sending and receiving messages. Around 11:30 p.m, he tried to contact the Titanic to warn them about ice in the area. You know, being a good neighbour, doing the responsible thing. The Titanic's wireless operator Jack Phillips, who as we discussed earlier was absolutely swamped with passenger messages and already stressed, essentially told Evans to shut up and get off the channel. Not in those exact words, but the telegraph equivalent of "not now, I'm busy." Evans, tired and probably annoyed at being dismissed, turned off his wireless set and went to bed. He went to bed at approximately 11:30 p.m. The Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. 10 minutes. If Evans had stayed on duty for 10 more minutes, he would have heard the Titanic's distress calls, and the entire disaster might have played out differently. Instead, he was asleep, completely unaware that the ship he'd just tried to warn was now desperately trying to call for help. Meanwhile, up on the Californian's deck, crew members were seeing some weird stuff on the horizon. They could see a ship's lights, a big passenger liner from the look of it, and around midnight they started seeing rockets going up, white rockets, shooting into the sky and exploding. Now, here's where things get absolutely mind-boggling. Distress rockets are white. Fireworks are typically coloured. White rockets going up from a ship at sea in the middle of the night is the maritime equivalent of someone waving a giant flag that says, "Help, we are dying." It's not subtle. It's not ambiguous. It's a universally recognised signal that something is seriously wrong. The crew members who saw these rockets reported them to their officers. The officers reported them to Captain Lord. And Captain Lord's response was essentially, that's odd. Maybe they're communicating with another ship or having some kind of celebration. Wake me if anything changes. Then he went back to sleep. Let me be clear about how absurd this is. Multiple crew members saw white rockets. They knew these were unusual. They reported it up the chain of command. And the response was basically probably nothing to worry about. It's like seeing someone frantically waving from a burning building and thinking, they must be really enthusiastic about something. Good for them. The level of misinterpretation required to see distress rockets and think party time is genuinely impressive in the worst possible way. This wasn't a split-second decision under pressure. Captain Lord had time to think about what he was seeing, to ask questions, to investigate. He chose not to. He chose to assume everything was fine and went to sleep while the largest maritime disaster of the era, unfolded within visual range. The Californian's crew saw at least 8 rockets over the course of about an hour. 8 separate signals that something was wrong. Each time they reported it to the officers. Each time the response was insufficient. Nobody woke up the wireless operator to check if there were distress messages. Nobody started the engines to investigate. Nobody took decisive action. The most they did was try to signal the ship with their Morse lamp, flashing lights to try to establish communication. But the Titanic wasn't looking for more signals. They were too busy trying to launch lifeboats and sending SOS messages via wireless that nobody on the Californian could hear because their operator was asleep. It's like watching someone drowning while you stand on shore trying to communicate via semaphore flags instead of just jumping in the water or throwing a life preserver. Now, to be somewhat fair to Captain Lord, and I'm being generous here, ships in that era did sometimes send up rockets for purposes other than distress. Company signals, communication between ships, even celebrations, though those were usually coloured rockets. And Lord was tired, had been dealing with the stress of navigating ice fields all day, and probably wasn't thinking as clearly as he should have been. But here's the thing. When you see white rockets at night from another ship and you're not sure what they mean, the prudent thing to do is investigate. The cautious thing to do is wake up your wireless operator and check if there are distress messages. The responsible thing to do is steam toward the ship and make sure everything's okay. Lord did none of these things. He assumed the best-case scenario and acted accordingly, which is exactly the wrong approach when the worst-case scenario is people dying. The next morning, when Evans woke up and turned on his wireless set, he immediately picked up messages about the Titanic sinking. The Californian finally started moving toward the reported position, but by then it was far too late. The Titanic had already gone down. The survivors were in lifeboats scattered across the ocean. Another ship, the Carpathia, was already on scene picking up survivors. The Californian arrived to find wreckage and bodies floating in the water, a scene of devastation that could have been partially or entirely prevented if they'd responded to those rockets hours earlier. Captain Lord and his crew had to live with the knowledge that they'd been close enough to help and had done nothing. It's the maritime equivalent of standing outside a burning building, hearing the fire alarm, seeing the smoke, and deciding not to call 911 because you're not sure if it's a real fire. The debate over the Californian's exact distance from the Titanic and whether they could have saved everyone continues to this day. Some argue they were too far away to reach the Titanic before it sank. Others argue that even if they couldn't reach in time to prevent the sinking, they could have picked up people from the water or taken on survivors from lifeboats, potentially saving hundreds who died of hypothermia. What's not debatable is that the Californian saw distress signals, had the capability to investigate, and chose not to. That decision, or non-decision, became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire disaster. Captain Lord spent the rest of his life defending his actions, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that the ship he saw wasn't the Titanic, that the rockets weren't distress signals. But the evidence suggests otherwise, and history has not been kind to his reputation. Meanwhile, back on the Titanic, as the lifeboats rowed away and the ship's bow sank lower in the water, something remarkable and terrible was happening. The ship's band, 8 musicians led by Wallace Hartley, kept playing. They'd been playing in the first-class lounge when the collision happened, and they'd continued playing as passengers began evacuation. They moved to the boat deck and kept playing there, providing music to calm people, to maintain some sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos. This wasn't their job. Nobody ordered them to keep playing. They could have tried to save themselves. Instead, they chose to provide comfort to others, even as the ship literally sank beneath their feet. Every single member of the band died in the disaster. Their sacrifice became one of the most iconic and heartbreaking elements of the Titanic story, a symbol of grace under pressure and service to others even in the face of death. The stories about what the band played last vary. Some survivors reported hearing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," a hymn, others heard different songs. The exact final number is lost to history, but what matters is that they kept playing until the very end, until the water was too high and the deck was too tilted to continue. It's impossible to imagine the courage that required, standing on a sinking ship knowing you're going to die and choosing to spend your final minutes providing comfort to strangers. Not running, not panicking, not desperately fighting for a spot on a lifeboat, just playing music until physics made it impossible to continue. If you want an example of the best of human nature in the worst of circumstances, the Titanic's band is it. Down in the engine rooms, another group of heroes was making similar sacrifices. The engineers, firemen and greasers stayed at their posts, keeping the lights on and the pumps running for as long as possible. The ship stayed lit until minutes before it finally went under, which meant people could see to evacuate, lifeboats could be loaded, distress signals could be sent. None of the engineering crew survived. They all died at their posts or trying to escape from the flooded lower decks at the last minute. They kept the ship functional until the very end, maintaining power, running pumps to slow the flooding, keeping the systems working so that others might have a chance to survive. These weren't glamorous deaths. Nobody saw them happen. Nobody could tell their individual stories of heroism. They just died doing their jobs in flooded dark spaces deep in a dying ship. But alongside this heroism, there was also panic and desperation. As the ship's list became more pronounced and people realized the lifeboats were gone, some passengers tried to force their way onto the remaining collapsible boats. There were reports of men trying to rush the boats, of officers firing warning shots to maintain order, of desperate people jumping into the water hoping to swim to safety. Some officers reportedly threatened to shoot anyone who tried to board lifeboats improperly. Whether they actually shot anyone is disputed, but the fact that guns were drawn at all tells you how close the situation came to complete breakdown. When faced with death, some people become saints, and others become desperate animals, and the Titanic's final hour had examples of both extremes and everything in between. Families made impossible choices. Men said goodbye to wives and children, knowing they'd never see each other again. Some first-class passengers gave up their spots in lifeboats to others. Some third-class passengers never even made it to the boat deck, trapped below by locked gates and confusing corridors. Some people jumped into the water despite knowing the temperature would kill them in minutes, preferring a quick death by hypothermia to drowning when the ship went down. Some stayed on the ship until the end, gathering in the stern as the bow sank lower, holding on to railings as the deck tilted at increasingly impossible angles, waiting for the inevitable final plunge. At approximately 2:18 a.m, the ship's lights flickered and went out as the engine rooms flooded completely. The engineers had kept them running until the absolute last possible moment. At 2:20 a.m, the Titanic broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. The stress of the bow being underwater while the stern was still above the surface created forces the ship's structure couldn't handle. The break was catastrophic, loud, visible to everyone watching from the lifeboats. The bow section sank immediately. The stern briefly settled back to a more level position, giving false hope to the hundreds still on board, then slowly tilted vertical, stood upright in the water for a few terrible moments, and then slipped beneath the surface. From collision to final sinking, 2 hours and 40 minutes. From the perspective of the people in the water or on the ship, it was both an eternity and far too fast. The people who went into the water faced death by hypothermia. The North Atlantic in April is cold enough to kill an unprotected person in 15 to 30 minutes. Most people didn't drown. They died of cold, their bodies shutting down as the frigid water sapped their core temperature. The lifeboats that were already away could hear the screaming, the hundreds of voices calling for help, calling for loved ones, eventually fading to silence as hypothermia and exhaustion claimed them. Some boats rowed back to try to pick up survivors, but by the time they returned, most of the people in the water were already dead. The ones they did pull from the water were often too far gone to save. The ocean was full of bodies in life jackets, floating motionless, dead from the cold despite having flotation. By 4 a.m, when the Carpathia arrived to rescue the survivors, it was all over. The Titanic was on the ocean floor. The dead were floating in the water or had already sunk. The survivors were in lifeboats traumatized, many suffering from hypothermia, all having witnessed things no person should have to see. The unsinkable ship that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of human engineering and confidence had become a tomb for over 1,500 people. And somewhere in the distance the Californian sat motionless, its captain and crew completely unaware until morning that the disaster they could have potentially helped prevent had already played out to its terrible conclusion while they slept. The final chapter of the Titanic's story wasn't written by engineers or executives or captains. It was written by the people who died with grace and the people who died in terror, by those who helped others and those who saved themselves, by the heroes who stayed at their posts and the desperate souls who fought for survival. And it was written by the ship that could have helped but didn't, the missed opportunity that has haunted maritime history for over a century. In the aftermath of the disaster, with 1,500 people dead and the supposedly unsinkable ship at the bottom of the Atlantic, someone had to answer the obvious question: how did this happen and whose fault was it? And like any major catastrophe involving multiple countries, corporate interests and reputations on the line, the answer to that question would depend entirely on who was asking it and what they wanted to hear. Enter two separate investigations, one American, one British, both claiming to seek truth and accountability, both arriving at conveniently different conclusions that somehow managed to protect the interests they were most concerned about protecting. It's the investigative equivalent of two people witnessing the same car accident, and somehow coming up with completely different stories about what happened based on whose insurance company they work for. The American inquiry started almost immediately after the Carpathia docked in New York with the Titanic survivors. Senator William Alden Smith, a Republican from Michigan, convened hearings that began on April 19th, just 4 days after the sinking. Smith was not a maritime expert. In fact, he knew almost nothing about ships, which became painfully obvious during the hearings when he asked questions like whether watertight compartments were designed to keep water in or out. Not exactly the kind of technical knowledge that inspires confidence in the investigation's rigour. But what Smith lacked in maritime expertise, he made up for in political ambition and a genuine desire to prevent future disasters. He was also immune to British corporate pressure, which meant he could ask uncomfortable questions that a British inquiry might prefer to avoid. The American hearings were messy, sometimes confused, occasionally bizarre, but they were also aggressive in pursuing answers that British authorities would have preferred to leave buried. Smith subpoenaed everyone he could get his hands on. J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman who'd survived by boarding a lifeboat, officers from the Titanic who'd made it out alive, crew members, passengers, technical experts. The captain of the Californian, Stanley Lord, got dragged to New York to explain why his ship had sat motionless while the Titanic sank within sight. The hearings lasted 6 weeks and produced over 1,000 pages of testimony, most of it taking place in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, which must have been surreal for survivors who'd just escaped death in the Atlantic and were now sitting in luxury hotel meeting rooms recounting the horror while journalists scribbled notes and senators posed for photos. It's the early 20th century equivalent of live streaming a congressional hearing, except with more wooden chairs and fewer Twitter hot takes. The American inquiry's conclusions were surprisingly hard-hitting, considering how easy it would have been to just blame bad luck and move on. Smith's report concluded that the Titanic was going too fast in dangerous waters, that the crew was inadequately prepared, that there weren't enough lifeboats, that Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian had failed in his duty to render assistance, and that the entire disaster was the result of systemic failures in maritime safety culture. The report essentially said this was preventable, multiple people screwed up, and we need new regulations immediately. It was blunt, direct, and probably not what White Star Line or the British Board of Trade wanted to hear. Smith specifically called out the fact that outdated lifeboat regulations and the culture of overconfidence in ship technology had contributed directly to the death toll. He didn't have the technical knowledge to dig deep into engineering details, but he understood that people had died because of bad decisions and inadequate preparation, and he wasn't shy about saying so in writing. The British inquiry, which started on May 2nd and lasted much longer than the American investigation, was a very different beast. It was led by Lord Mersey, a British jurist who knew maritime law and was presumably less likely to ask whether watertight compartments kept water in or out. The inquiry was more technical, more thorough in some ways, and also more diplomatic in how it assigned blame. This was partly because Britain had more at stake. The ship was British, the company was British, the maritime regulations were British, and finding too much fault might suggest that British engineering and British oversight weren't quite as superior as everyone liked to believe. Can't have that. The inquiry heard from 96 witnesses over 36 days and produced a detailed technical report that analysed the disaster from every angle. But here's where it gets interesting from a protecting institutional interests perspective. The British inquiry concluded that the accident was essentially an unfortunate event that could not have been reasonably foreseen or prevented. They found that Captain Smith was not at fault for maintaining speed through the ice field because that was standard practice at the time. They found that the watertight compartments and safety features were adequate despite clearly not being adequate enough to prevent the ship from sinking. They found that the lack of sufficient lifeboats was regrettable, but technically compliant with regulations, so nobody could really be blamed for following the rules even if the rules were catastrophically inadequate. It's the investigative equivalent of we've investigated ourselves and found that we did nothing wrong, though perhaps the regulations could use some minor updates. The British inquiry did find some fault with the Californian and Captain Stanley. Lord. They concluded that the ship Lord's crew saw was likely the Titanic, that the rockets were distress signals, and that Lord should have investigated. But even here, the criticism was measured and diplomatic. Lord wasn't criminally charged. He wasn't officially censured. He just had his reputation quietly destroyed by the implication that he could have saved lives but chose not to. This is the time-honoured British tradition of politely ruining someone's career without actually saying you're doing it, the stiff upper lip version of throwing someone under the bus while apologising for the inconvenience. The contrast between the two inquiries tells you everything you need to know about how institutions protect themselves during scandal investigations. The American inquiry, conducted by outsiders with no skin in the game, found systemic failures and called for major reforms. The British inquiry, conducted by insiders with reputations to protect, found that while the disaster was tragic, nobody really did anything wrong, and certainly British maritime supremacy remained unquestioned. Both inquiries looked at the same evidence, interviewed many of the same witnesses, and examined the same wreck of a ship that had killed 1,500 people. They just reached different conclusions about what it all meant, almost as if the conclusions were determined by political and economic interests rather than purely objective analysis. Shocking, I know. Captain Stanley Lord got the worst of both inquiries. The American report explicitly blamed him for not responding to distress signals. The British report was more measured but still damaging. Lord spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, insisting that the ship he saw wasn't the Titanic, that he didn't realise the rockets were distress signals, that he'd done everything a reasonable captain should have done. He petitioned for his reputation to be restored. He gathered evidence and testimonies supporting his version of events. He died in 1962, still fighting for vindication, his maritime career essentially over because of one night when he made the wrong call. Whether Lord deserved to become the primary scapegoat is debatable. He certainly made mistakes, but so did a lot of other people who faced less consequences. But someone had to take the fall for the disaster, and Lord was convenient. He wasn't employed by White Star Line, he wasn't part of the British maritime establishment, and his ship hadn't sunk, so there were survivors to blame him. Perfect scapegoat material. The real villains in many ways weren't individuals, but systems and attitudes. The overconfidence in technology that led designers to skimp on lifeboats and safety features. The corporate pressure that made captains prioritise speed over caution. The outdated regulations that hadn't kept pace with ship size and capacity. The culture of complacency that assumed modern ships were essentially unsinkable and planned accordingly. These weren't problems that could be fixed by blaming one captain or one company. They required industry-wide changes, regulatory updates, and a fundamental shift in how maritime safety was approached. And to their credit, both inquiries recognised this to varying degrees and recommended reforms. The investigations did lead to real changes, which we'll get to in the next section. But they also left a lot of questions unanswered or diplomatically avoided. Like exactly how much pressure J. Bruce Ismay put on Captain Smith to maintain speed. Ismay testified that he'd done no such thing, but his presence on the ship and his survival while so many died made him a controversial figure. Like whether the ship's builder Thomas Andrews had raised concerns about safety that were overruled for commercial reasons, he died in the sinking, so we only have second-hand accounts and speculation. Like whether better crew training and evacuation procedures could have saved more lives. Both inquiries acknowledged training was inadequate, but didn't dig too deep into why or who was responsible for that inadequacy. There was also the uncomfortable question of class and survival rates. First-class passengers had a survival rate of about 63%. Second class was around 43%. Third class was approximately 25%. These weren't random percentages. They reflected the fact that first-class passengers were closer to the lifeboats, had better information, were helped by crew members, and weren't behind locked gates. Third-class passengers were far from the boat deck, often didn't speak English, faced barriers both literal and social, and by the time many of them reached the upper decks, most lifeboats were gone. Both inquiries acknowledged these disparities but didn't really address the systemic discrimination that contributed to them. Can't rock the boat too much when investigating a sunken boat, apparently. The treatment of J. Bruce Ismay became a case study in public versus official blame. Officially, both inquiries found that Ismay hadn't done anything specifically wrong. He'd boarded a lifeboat that had space available, which was technically allowed. He testified that he hadn't pressured the captain to speed up. The investigations didn't find evidence of criminal negligence or malfeasance, but public opinion was far less forgiving. Ismay was pilloried in the press as J. Brute Ismay, a coward who saved himself while women and children died. The fact that he was the chairman of the company and had survived while the ship his company built sank made him a lightning rod for anger and grief. He spent the rest of his life in semi-retirement, his reputation destroyed not by official findings, but by the court of public opinion, which doesn't require evidence or fair hearings to reach verdicts. Both inquiries struggled with assigning criminal responsibility because nobody had actually broken any laws, at least not obviously. The lifeboat regulations were inadequate but were followed. The decision to maintain speed was questionable, but was standard industry practice. The lack of proper crew training was dangerous but wasn't illegal. The failure to respond to ice warnings was risky, but not criminal. It's hard to prosecute people for following procedures that turned out to be fatally flawed, even when those flawed procedures killed 1,500 people. This is why the inquiries focused on recommendations for future changes rather than prosecutions for past actions. Easier to fix the system going forward than to untangle the mess of who specifically was legally responsible for what happened. The inquiries also revealed uncomfortable truths about the limits of human knowledge and foresight. The designers genuinely believed they'd built an incredibly safe ship. The officers genuinely believed maintaining speed through ice fields was acceptable if you posted extra lookouts. The company genuinely believed the regulations they followed were adequate. Everyone involved thought they were being reasonably careful while actually being dangerously overconfident. How do you assign blame for that? How do you prosecute people for not knowing what they didn't know, even when in hindsight they should have known it? The investigations danced around this philosophical problem, sometimes acknowledging the role of systematic ignorance, while other times trying to pin specific failures on specific individuals. One thing both inquiries agreed on: the wireless communication situation was a mess. Having wireless operators who worked for a private company rather than being part of the ship's crew, prioritizing passenger messages over navigational warnings, having no requirement for 24-hour radio watch, all of these were identified as problems that needed fixing. This was one area where assigning blame was easier because the failures were so obvious and the solutions were straightforward. Make wireless operators part of the crew. Require ships to monitor distress frequencies continuously. Prioritize safety messages over commercial traffic. These recommendations were adopted quickly and probably prevented future disasters, so at least something good came from all the testimony and finger-pointing. The legacy of these investigations is complicated. They did lead to meaningful safety improvements, which we'll discuss in detail next. They did expose systemic problems that needed addressing. They did create a public record of what happened and why. But they also demonstrated how institutional interests shape official narratives, how scapegoats are chosen based on convenience rather than sole responsibility, and how difficult it is to assign blame fairly when a disaster results from cascading failures across multiple systems and organizations. The Titanic inquiries weren't perfect justice. They were political processes that happened to occur in the context of a tragedy, producing reports that reflected the interests and limitations of the people conducting them. Which is pretty much how all major disaster investigations work, then and now. The main difference is that today we have more sophisticated ways to pretend we're being objective, while still protecting the institutions we care about protecting. Progress. In the aftermath of the disaster, with 1,500 people dead and the supposedly unsinkable ship at the bottom of the Atlantic, someone had to answer the obvious question: how did this happen, and whose fault was it? And like any major catastrophe involving multiple countries, corporate interests and reputations on the line, the answer to that question would depend entirely on who was asking it and what they wanted to hear. Enter two separate investigations, one American, one British, both claiming to seek truth and accountability, both arriving at conveniently different conclusions that somehow managed to protect the interests they were most concerned about protecting. It's the investigative equivalent of two people witnessing the same car accident, and somehow coming up with completely different stories about what happened based on whose insurance company they work for. The American inquiry started almost immediately after the Carpathia docked in New York with the Titanic's survivors. Senator William Alden Smith, a Republican from Michigan, convened hearings that began on April 19th, just 4 days after the sinking. Smith was not a maritime expert. In fact, he knew almost nothing about ships, which became painfully obvious during the hearings when he asked questions like whether watertight compartments were designed to keep water in or out. Not exactly the kind of technical knowledge that inspires confidence in the investigation's rigour, but what Smith lacked in maritime expertise, he made up for in political ambition and a genuine desire to prevent future disasters. He was also immune to British corporate pressure, which meant he could ask uncomfortable questions that a British inquiry might prefer to avoid. The American hearings were messy, sometimes confused, occasionally bizarre, but they were also aggressive in pursuing answers that British authorities would have preferred to leave buried. Smith subpoenaed everyone he could get his hands on. J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman who'd survived by boarding a lifeboat, got hauled in front of the committee to explain his decisions and defend his survival. Officers from the Titanic who'd made it out alive were questioned extensively about everything from ice warnings to evacuation procedures. Crew members testified about what they saw and what orders they received. Passengers described the chaos on deck. Technical experts were brought in to explain ship design and maritime regulations. And most controversially, Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian was dragged to New York to explain why his ship had sat motionless while the Titanic sank within sight. The hearings lasted 6 weeks and produced over 1,000 pages of testimony, most of it taking place in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, which must have been surreal for survivors who'd just escaped death in the Atlantic and were now sitting in luxury hotel meeting rooms recounting the horror while journalists scribbled notes and senators posed for photos. It's the early 20th century equivalent of live streaming a congressional hearing, except with more wooden chairs and fewer Twitter hot takes. The hearings were theatre as much as investigation. Smith understood that public anger demanded answers, and he was going to provide them in the most visible way possible. Witnesses were questioned aggressively, sometimes repetitively, occasionally about things that weren't directly relevant but made good newspaper copy. The press ate it up. Headlines screamed about cowardice, negligence, corporate greed, and maritime incompetence. J. Bruce Ismay got absolutely savaged in the media. J. Brute Ismay, the papers called him, the man who saved himself while women and children died. Never mind that he'd technically done nothing illegal by boarding a lifeboat with available space. Public opinion doesn't care about technicalities when there's a villain to condemn, and Ismay made an excellent villain. Rich, connected to the company that built the ship, survived when the captain and so many others didn't. Perfect target for public rage. Smith's final report, issued on May 28th, was surprisingly hard-hitting given how easy it would have been to just blame bad luck and move on. The report concluded that the Titanic was going too fast through dangerous waters, that the crew was inadequately prepared for emergencies, that there weren't enough lifeboats, that wireless operators had mismanaged critical ice warnings, and that the entire disaster was the result of systemic failures in maritime safety culture. But the report's most controversial conclusion was about the Californian. Smith concluded definitively that the ship Captain Lord's crew had seen was the Titanic, that the rockets were distress signals, and that Lord's failure to investigate was dereliction of duty that directly contributed to loss of life. The report essentially painted Lord as the villain who could have prevented much of the tragedy but chose not to. This was convenient for multiple reasons. It deflected some blame from White Star Line and British maritime regulations, it gave the public a clear bad guy to hate, and it provided a simple narrative of failure that was easier to understand than complex discussions of systemic problems. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British were conducting their own investigation with very different priorities. The British Board of Trade Inquiry, officially called the Wreck Commissioners' Inquiry, began on May 2nd and was led by Lord Mersey, a respected British judge who actually knew maritime law. The inquiry was more technical, more thorough in examining engineering details, and also considerably more interested in protecting British institutional interests. This wasn't cynical corruption, it was just reality. The ship was British, built in British shipyards using British engineering. The company was British. The maritime regulations were British. The captain was British. Finding too much fault with any of these elements risked suggesting that British maritime supremacy wasn't quite as supreme as everyone liked to believe, which would be embarrassing for a nation that literally ruled the waves and whose economy depended heavily on shipping and shipbuilding. Can't have that. The British inquiry heard from 96 witnesses over 36 days and produced a detailed technical report that analysed the disaster from every conceivable engineering and operational angle. They examined the ship's construction, the quality of materials, the adequacy of safety features, the decisions made on the bridge, the evacuation procedures, everything. And after all that examination, they reached conclusions that were remarkably gentle on British institutions and individuals. The inquiry found that Captain Smith was not negligent for maintaining speed through the ice field, because that was standard practice at the time. They found that the watertight compartments and safety features were adequate for the ship's design, despite the obvious fact that they hadn't been adequate enough to prevent the ship from sinking. They found that the lack of sufficient lifeboats was regrettable, but technically compliant with Board of Trade regulations, so nobody could really be blamed for following the rules, even if the rules were catastrophically inadequate. It's the investigative equivalent of, we've investigated ourselves and found that while unfortunate events occurred, nobody did anything wrong according to the standards that existed at the time, though perhaps those standards could use some minor updates. The British inquiry did find some fault because completely exonerating everyone would have been too obviously a whitewash. They criticised the ship's speed through ice fields, though they stopped short of calling it negligent. They acknowledged that lifeboat drills were insufficient. They admitted that the evacuation could have been better organised. But these criticisms were measured, diplomatic, the kind of gentle suggestions for improvement that don't imply anyone was actually incompetent or culpable. The British establishment was very good at this kind of thing, acknowledging problems while avoiding blame, suggesting improvements while defending past decisions, appearing to take responsibility while actually deflecting it. It's an art form, really. But there was one person the British inquiry was willing to throw under the proverbial bus: Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian. The inquiry concluded that a ship seen from the Californian was probably the Titanic, that the rockets observed were likely distress signals, and that Lord should have made greater efforts to investigate what he was seeing. The language was more measured than the American report. No direct accusations of dereliction of duty, but the implication was clear. Lord had failed. This conclusion served multiple purposes. It provided a scapegoat who wasn't directly connected to White Star Line or the British maritime establishment. It deflected attention from more systemic failures in regulations and procedures. And it gave the public someone to blame who wasn't part of the institutions that the inquiry was implicitly protecting. The treatment of Captain Lord in both inquiries is fascinating from a scapegoating perspective. Lord became the personification of everything that went wrong, the man whose single failure could be pointed to as the reason hundreds died who might have been saved. Never mind that his ship had only a fraction of the capacity needed to save everyone. Never mind that multiple other ships in the area also failed to respond, either because they didn't have wireless or because they were too far away. Never mind that the Titanic's own failures, inadequate lifeboats, poor evacuation, excessive speed, would have caused massive loss of life, even if the Californian had responded immediately. Lord was convenient. His ship hadn't sunk, so he was alive to defend himself and be blamed. He wasn't employed by White Star Line, so condemning him didn't hurt the company. He wasn't part of the British maritime aristocracy, so his reputation could be sacrificed without threatening the establishment. Perfect scapegoat material. Lord spent the rest of his life fighting to clear his name. He gathered evidence, collected testimonies from his crew, commissioned analysis of distances and sightlines, petitioned for his case to be reopened. He insisted until his death in 1962 that the ship his crew saw was not the Titanic, that the rockets could have been signals between ships or company rockets rather than distress signals, that he'd made reasonable decisions based on the information available to him at the time. Some maritime historians have supported aspects of his defence, noting that the distances involved and the presence of other ships in the area complicate the simple narrative of Lord watching the Titanic sink while doing nothing. But the damage was done, his maritime career was effectively over, his reputation was destroyed. He became the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you fail to act in a crisis, regardless of whether the full truth was more complicated than the official narrative suggested. The contrast between how the two inquiries treated different parties is instructive. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of White Star Line, was pilloried in the American press, and questioned aggressively in both inquiries, but ultimately both found no legal wrongdoing. He'd boarded a lifeboat that had room. He testified that he hadn't pressured the captain. No evidence proved he'd done anything criminally negligent. But his reputation was destroyed anyway, not by official findings but by public opinion, which decided that a rich company chairman surviving while poor passengers died was morally if not legally wrong. Ismay lived the rest of his life in semi-retirement, his name synonymous with cowardice and corporate callousness, regardless of what the official inquiries concluded. The wireless operators on both ships, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride from the Titanic, Cyril Evans from the Californian, were treated sympathetically by both inquiries. Phillips had died in the disaster, so he couldn't be blamed. Bride and Evans were seen as working-class employees doing their jobs under difficult circumstances. The inquiries criticised the system that prioritised commercial messages over safety communications, but they didn't blame the individual operators. This was reasonable. The operators were following the procedures they'd been trained to follow. The fault was in the procedures themselves, in the commercial priorities of the Marconi Company, in the lack of regulations requiring 24-hour wireless watch. The inquiries correctly identified this as a systemic problem rather than individual failure. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was treated as a tragic hero by both inquiries. He died going down with the ship after trying to help passengers evacuate and assessing the damage. He'd reportedly wanted more lifeboats and better safety features, but been overruled by company management for commercial reasons. He couldn't defend himself or contradict this narrative because he was dead, which made him simultaneously a sympathetic figure and a useful tool for shifting blame onto the company, while avoiding too much criticism of British engineering. Andrews became the responsible engineer who tried to do the right thing, but was overruled by corporate greed. A simple, compelling story that absolved British engineering expertise while condemning business decisions. The treatment of the crew varied based on survival, rank, and who was conducting the inquiry. Officers who survived, like Second Officer Charles Lightoller, testified extensively and were generally portrayed as doing their best under impossible circumstances. Their decisions during evacuation were questioned but not condemned. Crew members lower in the hierarchy got less attention unless their testimony was particularly useful for establishing specific facts. Dead crew members, especially those who'd stayed at their posts like the engineers and the band, were lionized as heroes, which they were, but also conveniently couldn't contradict any narratives being constructed about what happened and why. The inquiries struggled with the fundamental problem of assigning blame when almost nobody had technically broken any laws. The lifeboat regulations were inadequate but had been followed. The decision to maintain speed was questionable, but was standard industry practice. The lack of proper crew training was dangerous but wasn't illegal. The failure to respond adequately to ice warnings was risky, but not criminal. Nobody had deliberately caused the disaster. It resulted from accumulated failures across multiple systems: regulatory, corporate, operational, cultural. How do you prosecute that? How do you assign legal responsibility for following procedures that turned out to be fatally flawed? This is why both inquiries focused more on recommendations for future changes than on criminal prosecutions for past actions. Easier to fix the system going forward than to untangle the impossible mess of who specifically was legally responsible for what happened. Both inquiries did agree on some things. The wireless communication system needed reform. 24-hour radio watch should be mandatory, safety messages should be prioritized, operators should be part of ship's crew rather than commercial employees. Lifeboat regulations needed complete overhaul. Ships should carry enough boats for everyone, drills should be mandatory, crew should be properly trained. Ice warnings should be taken more seriously and incorporated into navigation decisions systematically rather than haphazardly. Ship design should include higher bulkheads, better subdivision, more robust safety features. These recommendations were largely adopted and became the basis for the major safety reforms we discussed earlier. The inquiries also revealed the class disparities in survival rates, though they handled this uncomfortable truth delicately. First-class passengers had survived at much higher rates than third-class passengers. This wasn't random, it reflected proximity to lifeboats, access to information, assistance from crew, and physical barriers that prevented third-class passengers from reaching boat deck quickly. Both inquiries acknowledged these disparities but didn't really address the systemic discrimination that contributed to them. Couldn't rock the boat too much when investigating a sunken boat, especially when many of the survivors and victims' families came from wealthy, influential backgrounds who wouldn't appreciate implications that the class system had contributed to. Death tolls. The political dynamics of the inquiries were complex. The Americans wanted to assert jurisdiction and demonstrate that they could hold foreign companies accountable for disasters affecting American passengers. The British wanted to protect their maritime industry and national prestige while also appearing to take the disaster seriously. Both wanted to prevent future disasters, but they also had competing interests that shaped how they framed the problem and assigned responsibility. The result was two official reports that looked at the same evidence, interviewed many of the same witnesses, and reached broadly similar conclusions about what needed to change, but differed significantly in how they characterized responsibility and fault. The inquiries served their purpose despite their limitations. They created an official record of what happened. They exposed systemic problems that needed addressing. They provided a forum for survivors to tell their stories and for victims' families to seek some form of accountability. They generated public pressure for meaningful reform. They identified specific failures in design, procedure, and regulation that could be corrected. Whether they delivered justice is debatable. Captain Lord certainly didn't think so, and neither did J. Bruce Ismay, and arguments can be made that other individuals and institutions deserved more criticism than they received. But the inquiries did lead to real changes that prevented future disasters, which is ultimately more important than perfectly apportioning historical blame. The legacy of these investigations extends beyond the specific reforms they recommended. They established precedents for how major transportation disasters would be investigated in the future. The idea of independent public inquiries with power to subpoena witnesses and examine evidence became standard. The focus on systemic failures rather than just individual actions became a model for accident investigation. The recognition that regulations need to evolve as technology changes became accepted principle. The Titanic inquiries weren't perfect. They had political biases, they made scapegoats, they protected some interests while condemning others. But they were serious attempts to understand what went wrong and prevent it from happening again, which is all you can really ask from an investigation conducted in the immediate aftermath of tragedy, when emotions are high and complete information isn't yet available. Looking back over a century later, we can see that both inquiries got some things right and some things wrong. They correctly identified the inadequate lifeboats, the flawed evacuation procedures, the problematic wireless communication protocols, the dangerous practice of steaming at high speed through ice fields. They correctly recommended sweeping reforms that genuinely improved maritime safety. They correctly understood that this was a preventable disaster caused by accumulated failures rather than unavoidable bad luck. But they also engaged in scapegoating, protected institutional interests, avoided fully confronting class-based discrimination, and simplified complex situations into narratives that fit political needs. Which is pretty much how all major disaster investigations work, trying to balance truth-seeking with political reality, justice with practical reform, accountability with moving forward. The Titanic inquiries were flawed human attempts to make sense of tragedy and prevent future ones, and on that measure, despite their limitations, they largely succeeded. The ships that didn't sink because of the reforms these inquiries recommended are the real legacy, not the specific blame assessments that history has complicated and sometimes overturned. So the Titanic sank, over 1,500 people died, and the world was shocked to discover that the unsinkable ship was actually very sinkable. But here's the thing about major disasters. They have this annoying tendency to force people to actually fix the problems that caused them. The Titanic disaster was so catastrophic, so public, so impossible to ignore, that it became a catalyst for completely transforming how ships operated and how maritime safety was regulated. It's the kind of change that only happens when something goes so spectacularly wrong that everyone collectively agrees, okay, we need to make sure this never happens again. And to their credit, that's exactly what happened. The immediate aftermath of the disaster was chaos. Survivors arrived in New York traumatized and grieving. Families waited desperately for news of loved ones who would never come home. The press went absolutely wild with the story. This was the biggest news of 1912, the kind of disaster that dominated headlines for months. And very quickly, people started asking the obvious question, how did this happen to a ship that was supposed to be unsinkable? Who was responsible? What went wrong? And most importantly, how do we prevent this from happening again? These questions led to two major investigations, one in the United States and one in Britain, both of which would expose the systemic failures we've been discussing and lead to fundamental changes in maritime law. The American investigation started almost immediately. Senator William Alden Smith, a Republican from Michigan who had never been particularly interested in maritime issues before, took charge of the inquiry with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a cause. Smith wasn't a maritime expert. He famously asked questions that revealed his lack of technical knowledge, like whether watertight compartments were meant to keep water out or in, which is the kind of question that makes maritime professionals wince. But what Smith lacked in expertise, he made up for in determination and showmanship. He wanted answers, he wanted accountability, and he wanted them in front of as many cameras and journalists as possible. This was early 20th century politics at its finest. A senator using a disaster to make a name for himself while also, to be fair, actually trying to prevent future disasters. Sometimes good outcomes happen for self-interested reasons, and that's okay. The American hearings were dramatic. They brought in survivors, crew members, wireless operators, and officials from White Star Line and Marconi. They grilled J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star chairman who'd survived by getting in a lifeboat, about his role in the disaster. They questioned crew members about the evacuation procedures, the ice warnings, the decision to maintain speed. They examined wireless operators about communication protocols. They even tried to get Captain Lord from the Californian to explain why his ship didn't respond to distress signals, though Lord maintained until his death that he'd done nothing wrong. The hearings were sometimes chaotic, often repetitive, occasionally insightful, and always public. Americans loved a good show, and the Titanic investigation delivered spectacle along with substance. The British investigation, led by Lord Mersey, was more technical and less theatrical but equally important. The British had a vested interest in not completely destroying their shipbuilding industry's reputation, so there was definitely some institutional pressure to not be too harsh on the companies and individuals involved. But they also couldn't ignore the magnitude of the disaster or the systemic problems it revealed. The British inquiry was more focused on technical questions: the design of the ship, the structural integrity, the safety equipment, the regulations that governed ship construction and operation. They brought in naval architects, ship designers, and maritime experts to analyse what had gone wrong from an engineering perspective. Both investigations reached similar conclusions, even if they emphasised different aspects. The ship had been travelling too fast through known ice fields. The lookouts didn't have binoculars. There weren't enough lifeboats. The crew wasn't adequately trained for evacuations. The wireless operators prioritised passenger messages over navigation warnings. The Californian failed to respond to distress signals. The entire maritime industry had become complacent, trusting in technology and size rather than proper safety protocols. The culture of overconfidence we've been discussing throughout this story was exposed and condemned. Not everyone was happy with these conclusions. White Star Line and various officials tried to deflect blame. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the public anger was intense enough that real change became inevitable. And that's where the legacy of the Titanic really begins, because the disaster led to the most comprehensive overhaul of maritime safety regulations in history. First, and most obviously, the lifeboat requirements were completely rewritten. The old regulations based on ship tonnage were scrapped and replaced with simple, sensible rules. Ships must carry enough lifeboats for every single person on board, not some people, not first-class passengers, everyone. This seems obvious in hindsight, but remember that before the Titanic, the prevailing wisdom was that lifeboats were mainly for transferring people from a damaged ship to a rescue ship, not for saving everyone if the ship sank. The Titanic proved that assumption was fatally wrong, and the new regulations reflected that harsh lesson. Ships built after the disaster had lifeboats lining their decks, sometimes so many that they cluttered the promenade spaces that first-class passengers had previously enjoyed. But nobody cared about aesthetics anymore. Safety had finally become the priority. The regulations also mandated that lifeboat drills had to be conducted regularly, with both crew and passengers. No more skipping the drill because it's inconvenient or boring. No more assuming everyone knows what to do. Ships had to practice emergency evacuations so that when a real emergency happened, people wouldn't be learning on the job. The crew needed to know which lifeboat stations they were responsible for, how to operate the davits, how to load passengers efficiently, and how to maintain order during a crisis. Passengers needed to know where their lifeboat stations were and how to get there. These seem like basic, common-sense requirements, but before the Titanic they were optional at best. After the Titanic, they were mandatory and enforced. It's amazing how death concentrates the mind on practical safety measures. Then there was the wireless communication issue. Before the Titanic, wireless operators worked for private companies like Marconi, not for the ships they served on. Their priorities were commercial messages, not safety. After the Titanic, new regulations required that ships maintain a 24-hour wireless watch. Someone had to be monitoring the radio frequencies at all times, ready to receive distress calls or navigation warnings. No more wireless operators going to bed at 11:30 p.m. and missing the disaster that happened 10 minutes later. The regulations also standardized distress signals and established protocols for prioritizing emergency communications over commercial traffic. The SOS signal became universal and mandatory. Ships were required to respond to distress calls from other vessels. The whole system was formalized and regulated in a way that made the pre-Titanic era look amateur by comparison. These changes were formalized in the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS, which was first adopted in 1914, just 2 years after the disaster. SOLAS represented a fundamental shift in how maritime safety was approached. Instead of letting individual countries set their own standards, which led to inconsistency and races to the bottom, where companies registered ships in countries with the weakest regulations, SOLAS created international standards that applied to all passenger ships regardless of flag. It was revolutionary for its time, and it's still in effect today, regularly updated but built on the foundation laid after the Titanic disaster. Every time you board a cruise ship and see all those lifeboats and safety equipment, and participate in that mandatory safety briefing, you're experiencing the legacy of the Titanic. Those regulations exist because 1,500 people died when they didn't exist. But wait, there's more. Because the Titanic also led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, which is possibly the most direct and practical legacy of the disaster. The Ice Patrol was established in 1913 by international treaty, operated by the United States Coast Guard, with the specific mission of monitoring iceberg danger in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships that travel those routes pay fees to support the patrol, which uses ships, aircraft, and now satellites to track icebergs, plot their positions, and warn vessels about ice dangers. It's like having a dedicated team whose only job is to prevent ships from doing what the Titanic did. And here's the really impressive part. Since the Ice Patrol was established, not a single ship that heeded the patrol's warnings has been lost to an iceberg collision in the North Atlantic. Not one. That's over a century of ships safely navigating waters that killed the Titanic, all because someone decided to actually monitor the ice instead of just hoping for the best. The disaster also changed ship design in fundamental ways. The height of watertight bulkheads was increased to create truly sealed compartments. Double hulls became standard for passenger ships, providing protection against exactly the kind of side-scraping collision that doomed the Titanic. Structural integrity standards were improved. The quality of materials used in hull construction was regulated more carefully. Naval architects started designing ships with the assumption that they might hit something, rather than assuming perfect conditions and flawless operation. It's the engineering equivalent of defensive driving, plan for problems rather than hoping they won't happen. The whole philosophy shifted from build it big and impressive to build it safe and survivable. There were cultural changes too, less tangible but equally important. The Titanic disaster killed the idea that technology alone could guarantee safety. It exposed the danger of overconfidence and complacency. It showed that fancy engineering and impressive size meant nothing if you didn't have proper procedures, adequate training, and respect for the forces you were dealing with. The maritime industry went from "we've mastered the ocean" to "the ocean will kill you if you're not careful, and sometimes even if you are careful, so you'd better have backup plans and safety margins and systems designed to fail gracefully." This shift in mindset might be the most important legacy of all, because it changed how engineers and ship operators approach their work. The disaster also had economic and social impacts that rippled out for decades. Immigration patterns were affected because people became more cautious about ocean travel. The transatlantic passenger trade shifted as safety became a bigger selling point than luxury or speed. Insurance companies got much more interested in ship safety standards because they just paid out massive claims and didn't want to repeat the experience. The whole relationship between private companies and public safety regulations changed, with governments asserting more control over industry practices in the name of protecting citizens. The Titanic disaster was a watershed moment in the progressive era push for regulation and safety standards across all industries, not just shipping. The legal and liability frameworks changed too. Before the Titanic, shipping companies had broad protections against lawsuits and limited liability for disasters. After the Titanic, those protections were questioned and in some cases reduced. Passengers and their families had more legal recourse when things went wrong. Companies couldn't just shrug and say, "Well, the ocean is dangerous. What did you expect?" They had to demonstrate that they'd taken reasonable precautions and followed proper procedures. The burden of proof shifted somewhat from victims having to prove negligence to companies having to prove they'd followed best practices. This legal evolution made companies more careful, because suddenly there were real financial consequences for cutting corners on safety. And perhaps most fundamentally, the Titanic disaster changed how we think about risk and safety in any large-scale technological system. The lessons learned aren't limited to ships. The idea that multiple small failures can cascade into catastrophic disaster applies to aviation, nuclear power, space exploration, and any complex system where humans interact with technology in high-stakes environments. The Titanic showed that you can't just assume the best-case scenario. You have to plan for failures, build in redundancy, train people properly, maintain clear communication, and respect the fact that even the best engineering can fail under the wrong circumstances. These principles have been applied to countless other fields, saving lives in contexts that have nothing to do with ships or icebergs. The wreck of the Titanic itself, discovered in 1985, became an ongoing reminder and research opportunity. Scientists studied how the ship broke apart, analysed the quality of materials used in construction, examined the damage patterns to understand what happened during the collision. Each discovery refined our understanding of the disaster and validated or challenged assumptions about what went wrong. The wreck became both a gravesite to be respected and a classroom for learning about structural failure, corrosion, deep-sea environments, and maritime engineering. It's morbid but useful. We're still learning from the Titanic over a century after it sank. So when we look at the legacy of the Titanic disaster, we see fundamental and lasting change across multiple domains. Maritime law was rewritten. Ship design was revolutionized. Safety culture was transformed. International cooperation on safety standards became normal. The whole industry shifted from prioritizing speed and luxury to prioritizing survival and preparedness. And while none of this brought back the 1,500 people who died in the North Atlantic on April 15, 1912, it probably prevented countless other disasters. The ships that didn't sink because they had proper lifeboats, the crews who saved lives because they'd practiced evacuations, the passengers who survived because wireless operators were actually monitoring for distress calls, they all benefited from changes that only happened because the Titanic disaster was too big and too public to ignore. The Titanic went from being a symbol of human hubris and technological overconfidence to being a catalyst for systematic safety improvements. The ship that was marketed as unsinkable became the reason ships became actually safer. Sometimes the worst disasters lead to the best reforms, not because the disaster itself creates anything good, but because it forces people to confront problems they'd been ignoring and fix systems they'd been assuming were fine. The Titanic's legacy isn't the shipwreck at the bottom of the ocean or the tragic stories of people who died. It's the lives saved by the changes made in response to those deaths. And in that sense, maybe there's some small consolation in knowing that such a terrible disaster led to such meaningful improvement in maritime safety. The people on the Titanic paid a horrific price for lessons that the rest of us learned from their tragedy. That's not redemption, but it's something.